Well, Happy New Year, everybody. Hope you're off to a great start. It's been fun to be in ministry with you guys over this past year and just to think back on everything that God has done through our church and in our own personal lives. Hope you've had a chance to celebrate. It's hard to believe that we're starting a brand new year together, but I'm honored that you guys are starting it with us. Today, I want to kind of set the tone for this coming year and talk about this idea that for those of us that are following Jesus, our calling is to actually be different. And we see this when you look through the writings of the Apostle Paul. I want to start off in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24. Paul writes, "Don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win." All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that fades away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should do. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Now, that's a fascinating analogy. And what you have to understand about Paul is, especially if you don't know a lot about him, he wasn't one of these guys who just sort of skated through life. He took Jesus at his word that one day he was going to return and set everything right. He was absolutely convinced that it was not some kind of vague, grandiose idea to make people feel better. He was sold out to the idea that would happen in his lifetime. And because of that, Paul lived his life as if each day were his last. He was wide open to not holding anything back, and his expectation was that the church would live the same way. And so there was this deep sense of urgency about Paul. And what Paul was saying was simple, that every human being, every man, every woman, every child is actually running a race. And we're all competing to build our one and only life. And so what he's saying is whether you get 10 years or 50 years, or maybe you get blessed with 110 years, it's the only shot that you and I have. So we have to be careful how we live our one and only life. To put it another way, maybe what Paul is saying is make sure that you're running the right race. So here's the deal. You and I can run a lot of races. You and I live in a world where people walk up to the starting line every single day. And most of us are going to start that race again tomorrow morning. Our culture is this driven, fast-paced world where standards are really, really high. We're judged every single day by our earning capacity or maybe the neighborhood that we live in or what we drive or where our kids go to school or who we hang out with. And if we're honest, most of us would be willing to pay almost anything to ensure that we win that race. And that's fine. Like you can build your life that way. You can run those races. It's just when that race comes to an end or when our life closes out, we won't really have anything of substance to show. And we do it all the time. Some of us, we're willing to spend our entire lifetime building our own lives based on somebody else's opinion or this certain image that we want to portray. We can build our lives on things like money or power or sex or status. We can spend our whole time and energy and all of our resources just chasing after somebody else's approval. But what Paul is saying to the church, and I think saying to all of us, is that you got to be absolutely sure that you're building your one and only life on something that actually matters. If you put it in the form of a question, it's, are you running the right race that pursues something that is temporary, or are you running a race that pursues something eternal? Either way, it's possible, right? Like I can build a life of self-focus. I can mask it so that it's not obvious, but I can build a life that is totally focused on my comfort or my satisfaction or my success or my sense of happiness and fulfillment. Or I can position my life on something beyond myself, something that's bigger or more significant or more fulfilling or more rewarding. We can actually have a life that is lived on purpose. So what I want to do is dig into this because I think there's a lot of great insight that Paul gives us on how to build the right kind of life. If you back up one chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, there's this discussion about idols and what you're supposed to do with the food that gets offered to them. And it's important to understand that the churches Paul addressed weren't like our churches. Like idolatry was a big deal in Paul's day. Now, nobody struggles with that in our day, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. There's a really important insight that I want you to see. I want to pick it up in verse 4. He writes, so what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Well, we all know that an idol is not really a god and that there's only one God. There may be so-called gods both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. But for us, there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we live. However, not all believers know this. Some are accustomed to thinking of idols as being real. So when they eat food that has been offered to idols, they think of it as worship of real gods, and their weak consciences are violated. It's true that we can't win God's approval by what we eat. We don't lose anything if we don't eat it, and we don't gain anything if we do. Now watch this, verse 9. But you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. Now, in essence, what Paul is saying is, look, you know idols aren't real. There's just one God. So in the grand scheme of things, whether you eat meat or not, it's not that big of a deal. But if what you do confuses someone else or stands in the way of them knowing God, then it's not worth doing. Now, let me reduce that into a principle. I think what Paul is saying is you have to live your life based on purpose and not preference. See, our purpose for those of us that are following Jesus is to allow ourselves to become literally a conduit. It's allowing God to use us in such a way so that when people look at our lives, they actually see Jesus. And that means we've got to pay attention to how we live. Because whether we want it to be true or not, our lives are a testimony. It is a witness to those around us. And this is not about being a good person. And it's not about trying to be perfect, because both are an impossibility. But what it is about is actually learning to exercise what I call situational awareness. Like, don't do anything that willingly causes a contradiction. Well, what does that mean? Well, it simply means that we have to pay attention to how we act. We got to think about the words that are coming out of our mouth, because our actions and the words that we speak, they literally speak volumes to others about what it is that we believe. And if we're going to hang out with Jesus, our preference has to take a back seat to our purpose. Paul leans into this in chapter 9. This is verse 19. He says, even though I'm a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so that I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who don't follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from the law so I can bring them to Christ. But I don't ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. See, following Jesus ought to radically redirect our priorities. That is certainly true for the church. I've been thinking a lot about this. I honestly believe that the church's greatest enemy is not the devil. It's not a complacent government or a disinterested culture. I think the greatest enemy of the church is actually Christians. Believe it or not, it's us. Here at Cokesbury, we've got to continue to fight to be a public church. And what I mean by that is we can't slip into a mentality of what's in it for me, or, I don't like that, or why do we do this, or maybe the music's too loud, or why do we sometimes play secular music? See, the sole reason we exist, and I would argue the sole reason that any church exists, is for the sake of spreading the gospel. It's doing whatever it takes to make sure that Jesus gets made famous and that his way of life gets shared with as many people as possible. And that's also true not only of the church, but for those of us who are following Jesus. See, again, our primary objective becomes positioning ourselves to live the kind of life that points other people to Jesus. Here's a good thought. This is from chapter 10, verse 12. Paul says, so if you think you're standing, watch out that you don't fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he'll not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he'll also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. And so here's the principle. Live your life as a victor and not a victim. I want to say that again because I think it's important. Live your life as a victor and not a victim. And what do I mean by that? See, in other words, you and I've got to continue to push ourselves to learn to see that things like heartache or times of struggle or seasons of pain, they're not punishment, they're actually preparation. You know this. Following Jesus does not insulate us from pain. It's not like we become Christians and suddenly get some kind of cosmic insurance policy that inoculates us from discomfort. You and I live in a fallen world, and we are fallen people. Bad stuff is going to happen. And I think we need to understand that while bad things happen, God can use those experiences to grow us and shape us and to get us ready for what's coming next. So you've got to get yourself in the mentality where even in the darkest moments, you see that with God on your side, you can actually achieve victory. You and I live in a culture where people too easily slip in to why me? And the question we always have to ask ourselves is why not me? But with Christ, we can do all things. Here's one more. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. Paul writes, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church of God. I too try to please everyone in everything I do. I don't just do what's best for me. I do what's best for others so that many may be saved. I like that. I don't do what's best for me. So here's the principle. Learn to live beyond yourself. Isn't that easy? Learn to live beyond yourself. What I'm saying is, as we enter this brand new year together, I want you to be the biggest difference maker in people's lives. As you go about living your everyday life, when you go to work or when you go back to school, when you're hanging out with your friends, when you're out in your neighborhood, when you're interacting with other human beings, the goal is when they think about who has made the biggest difference in their lives, I want them to actually think of you. Most of us have figured it out. If you're not making an impact with your life, you really are wasting the opportunity that you've been given. And this desire, this need, if you will, I think it is deep-seated inside every human soul. That's why nobody ever sets out to have an average life. That's why we didn't like being picked last when we were on the playground when we were kids. See, God has placed inside every human soul the need to know that our lives matter, that the time that we spend, it can actually be redeemed, that we can actually live our lives in such a way that when our time on this planet is done, we can leave this place knowing that we did something really special. Y'all, this church that we've been given, this place called Cokesbury, whether you're an on-campus person or you are living somewhere out where you just plug in online with us, it is a unique opportunity. God is moving in our lives and God is moving in our community. That's why I say all the time, it's going to ultimately be okay. I don't know what's coming in 2023, but I know that God is going to meet us there, and I know that God is not done with us yet. And so if there's one thing that I could say to kind of encapsulate what I want 2023 to be for us as individuals and families and as a community of faith, is to just sell out to the idea that we can be different, that we can live our lives knowing that the best is still yet to come. And I promise, if you will live your life believing that God is not done, God will continue to do great things. Again, thanks for joining us. I can't wait to see you guys on campus starting next week. I hope you have a great rest of the week. I love you.